Hello and welcome to the Santee Church of Christ Bible Rewind, where we review the last Sunday morning class, actually Sunday afternoon class, that we had online. We are currently doing our classes online. We have one on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We're currently in 1 Peter. This class is taking place Sunday afternoons at 3 o'clock online. Live online. We are currently in Deuteronomy, and we're in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Now, chapter 12 of Deuteronomy ends the historical recounting in the book and starts with God dispensing through Moses specific laws on how they need to set up their infrastructure for worship and how they are to set up government. And we left off with the three main festivals they were to attend every year. And they were told that they were to appoint judges as well. And eventually they do appoint judges. And it's actually, when you look at it, Moses himself was one of those judges. And Joshua succeeds him after that. So let's get right into it. And he says in chapter 17, verse 1, "You shall not sacrifice to Jehovah your God an ox or sheep in which there is a blemish, any evil thing, for it is a hateful thing to Jehovah your God," which is just kind of like a supplemental statement, kind of out of nowhere. It seems that way. "When there is found among you in one of your gates, which Jehovah your God is giving you, a man or woman who does that which is evil in the sight of Jehovah your God, in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods, and worshipped them, or the sun, or the moon, or the host of heavens, which I have not commanded, and it has been revealed to you, and you have heard, and searching have searched, and behold, it is true, and the thing is confirmed, that this hateful thing has been done in Israel. Then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, the man or woman, and you shall stone them with stones, and they shall die at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. He shall not be put to death with the mouth of 1 witness. The hand of the witness shall be first on him to put him to death, a hand of all the people last, and you shall put away the evil from among you." Now, that is right after he establishes this covenant where he says you're going to be electing judges in your regions to judge you. So what is God warning against here is the question. Brent asked the question, what is the warning against them doing, and why does this issue keep coming up? And very briefly I said, what do we learn from this? Well, you know, God's looking to combat idolatry, and he's trying to build faith in his people. That's what he's been doing this entire time with them in the wilderness. These 40 years where he's basically done everything for them. In the context, the idolatry is the issue. It keeps coming up because it is a weakness of mankind in general, and Israel is no exception. It takes discipline and a persevering heart to grow faith to combat idolatry. These people show that issue of a lack of dedication, and God is taking them to task for it. This section is actually an extension of chapter 16, where it starts the narrative against idolatry. Why would God include the offering of a blemished animal within this context? I couldn't tell you. I'm assuming that was just part of what God considered. He may have been just what he considered as part of idolatry. It's simply writing style for pre-litigation. When we look at these texts, God repeats himself over and over, and it's seemingly like he's just repeating himself. Well, essentially, he'll say one thing, and then later he'll say, this is how you take care of it. In this case, he's already talked about not committing idolatry. Now he's saying, if you commit idolatry, you stone them. And now he's saying, if you commit idolatry, you stone them, make sure you have more than 1 witness. So we see him building with these clauses within this covenant that he's making with them. It's a contract. He's not just rambling. He refers to the sin and the execution and how that is to be taken care of. So in the next section, we're going to read 8 through 13. If a matter is too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between cause and cause, or between stroke and stroke, matters of life within your gates, in other words, within your town, then you shall rise up and go to the place which Jehovah your God shall choose. So this is more like a regional, governmental thing. And you shall come to the priest of the Levites and to the judge who is in those days and shall inquire. And they shall declare the word of judgment to you, and you shall do according to the word which they declare to you from that place which Jehovah shall choose. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you. You shall do according to the mouth of the law which they direct you, and according to the judgments which they shall deliver to you. You shall not turn aside from the word which they declare to you, the right or the left, and the man who acts with pride, so as not to listen to the priest who is standing to serve Jehovah your God there, or to the judge, even that man shall die. And you shall put away evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear, and shall not presume anymore. So the judge and the priest give their, they give, this is our judgment on this. Do this. God says when they say that, you got to do it because they're working from the law. That's the assumption here anyway. So what are they to do in regarding to their leaders and their judges? Are there any new covenant concepts here? And consider Romans 13 and Hebrews 13:17. Now, when you look up those passages, Paul is basically addressing the Christian church, and he's telling the Christians they need to adhere to the government. And that is, I believe, speaking more of a secular government, but it could extend as well into the church government, or in other words, the people who are watching over their souls, their elders. I would extend it into that as well, that, God, and the argument that Paul makes is that God is the one who establishes governments. And so we need to be in compliance with those governments. So once a judge issues the judgment, you shall be careful to do according to all that they direct you. These were cases where people could not find remedy between themselves and their towns. So they brought the case before the appointed judge and priest where God says to go. It was the responsibilities of these authorities to know the law and the will of God. And we find much, much later in the King's era, a lot of these judges didn't really know the law very well. It was a terrible thing. The first part of Romans addresses the need to submit to authorities, and similar with Hebrews 13:7. The second part of 1 Corinthians 13 reveals the heart of the Christian in the phrase, love is the fulfillment of the law. If a person practices the second part, the first part will work itself out. There are strong words from Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 when it comes to disputes between brothers within the church, when he says, don't go to secular courts to work things out. Work it out between yourselves. And in fact, if you think you're being defrauded, just be defrauded. It's better to just be defrauded by your brother than it is to bring churches to bring issues between brothers to a secular court and bring shame upon the church. Okay, so in this next section, it says, when you come into the land which Jehovah your God is giving you and have possessed it and settled in it, and you shall say, let me set a king over me like all the nations around me, then you shall certainly set a king over you. Pretty simple. You may not give an alien the rule over you, one who is not your brother. Only he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to turn back to Egypt. so as to multiply horses, since Jehovah has said to you, you shall not again return in this way anymore. And he shall not multiply wives to himself, and he shall not turn aside, and his heart shall not turn aside, and he shall not greatly multiply to himself silver or gold. So the king should not have financial gain in mind when he wants to be king. It shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, and before the priests and Levites, and it shall be with him. He shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Jehovah your God, to keep all the words of this law, and to keep statutes and do them, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, and that he may prolong his days over his kingdom, he and his sons, in the midst of Israel. So there are the directions and the directives for the king, how to select a king, and what the king is to do when he becomes king. So, and then we find later, of course, that when the kings do come, that after Solomon, and even with Solomon, and even with David, with all of them, there are issues. But some of these basic things that God calls out, they kind of fail in miserably later. And that's just a human nature thing. And, that if we're not diligent, we can mess up. So what was it? The question is, was it acceptable for Israel to have a king? And what were the requirements for appointing a king? And what were the requirements for the king himself? And my answer was, there's no obvious reason from this text to think that God did not want Israel to have a king. We find later that the reasons they asked for a king are at issue. They are rejecting God when they ask. So they are asking for the wrong reasons. In this section, God appears to have no issue with it. The term, let me set a king over me, like all the nations around me, could be construed as offensive to God. And we find in Samuel that it is an offense to God, because they're looking to rely on the king and not on God. So there was an issue when it came time for them to ask for a king, yes. Israel was to be separated from the rest of the nations. They weren't to look like the rest of the nations. They were to look different and act different. We read at the end of Judges and find that Israel had lost its way already by the time the Judges come along. Each man was doing that which was right in his own eyes. Where were the judges and the priests during this time? It's like he didn't have judges and priests that were even doing their jobs, and then they were looking for a king, and they were doing it for all the wrong reasons. Of course, they all failed, and there were no issues with God's systems. In 1 Samuel, Samuel says that Samuel made his sons judges, Joel and Abijah, and they were corrupt, and it suggests that Samuel may not have inquired of God whether or not to do this. And God spoke to Samuel before. Why didn't he speak to God again? So I'm not saying that he didn't inquire. I just didn't find where he did inquire of God. Why didn't God stop Samuel from this great error? Well, this brings into question not so much did God want Israel to have a king, but knowing the futility of Israel's inability to adhere to the priest-judge system, a king might be needed later because it's a more centralized way of doing things. There's a lot of speculation about all of this stuff. Isn't Jesus our king? This foreshadowing reveals how man gets it so wrong, but God can get it right. The king was to be selected from Israel, not a foreigner. He's not to make profit from his authority or increase wives. He was not to lead them or cause anyone to want to return to Egypt. He was to be humble and remain that way. He is to get a copy of the law and read it. He was actually to write it and read it continually to keep himself in check and obedience to God. It stands to reason that God would prefer the nation to be led through judges and priests. That system would be decimated or disseminated, decimated, but disseminated throughout the land and would be less subject to corruption to a nation as a whole, as opposed to one person who could be corrupted. Once you have a monarchy, it could happen instantly, and we see that happening later on in the time of kings. Just that sort of thing, just the kind of thing that God would fear. So some of the things that were brought up. Israel does not fail to grow faith. Israel does fail. It was noted that when you read into the next books, Judges and the Kings and the prophets and that sort of thing, that Israel does fail to grow their faith to a point where they rely on God and they fall into idolatry with virtually every king. There are some who even cut down the groves, but for the most part, most of them have some sort of allowance going on with some sort of idolatry. Even with the good kings, it was not a good thing, and so we see the people falling into idolatry, and which is just simply relying on something else or someone else other than God. So they were superstitious during that time. Most people were superstitious. They didn't understand science. They didn't look around and understand that, the heat. They didn't know that heat heats up water on the ocean and it forms a cloud and then it makes rain and comes over. They believed that there was a rain god. They attributed everything to a specific god, and they were very superstitious about things. And so there were gods for everything, and this was the mind of the people in the land that they were coming into. And we understand from the science as well, that that's how rain is made. But we also understand that God is at the foundation of that science. He's the one who made it all. So they assigned gods to the natural world. They were void of understanding. Anything can become an idol if we're not careful. Some nations were blessed, and when the Israelites looked at other nations that were blessed, who worship idols, they thought, well, we want some of that too. So they were bringing idolatry in with their belief with God, and so we see the faith in God being watered down, and this can happen to the Christian today. Even still today, we can rely on things instead of on God. In Malachi, it was brought up that the people were bringing and offering blemished animals that were unclean, and these were evil before God. And God tells them, look, you wouldn't offer that to a governor. Why are you offering it to me? And that's a great way of thinking about it. Sometimes we put the secular world as more important than the world we should be in with God. So when it came to the judges, when they made a ruling, you had to abide by it, like it or not. That was the way it was supposed to be. Later in their history, they do have judges, but we find that there's a cycle that they have in their judges. God would basically have to select a deliverer. They would fall into sin. God would allow nations to come up against them and defeat them, and they would repent, and God would send a judge who was also this deliverer. And so we see that cycle happen in the book of Judges. And it continues on throughout their history. In Exodus 18, we see that Moses was the judge, and his father-in-law advises him to divide the responsibility. So they already know what it means to appoint judges from their tribes. This is what the advice was, and that's what Moses did. So each tribe was already instituting this system of having judges and priests over them to bring their problems to. This isn't a new thing. One of the things that was brought up was in today's day and age, within the church paradigm, or even within our own personal lives. If we're going to confront somebody, if we're bringing a problem that we have with somebody, if we think they've sinned against us, and if we're going to take it to an elder in the church, we better be sure this is a real issue and not something that we, either can't be worked out between us, or that maybe some introspection needs to happen. What part am I playing in this problem? It had better be a real issue and not something trivial if we're going to take it to our elders or to the church. In Matthew 18, and this is something that we spoke about on more than one occasion, it talks about if you're wronged, you take it to that person and say, look, you did this sin against me. Please don't do it anymore. You need to repent. If they refuse, and they, they're saying, yeah, I did it. So you bring a couple of witnesses and then you say, look, you did this, don't do it anymore. And they still refuse. Then you can take it to the church or the elders and then to the church as a whole. My point in bringing that up was that sometimes there are people who just don't want to repent. And so the church at that point has to take some sort of action when a person is like that. And you can find that in the scriptures. I didn't want to go over the whole thing. But there are some similarities in today's day and age within the churches. And the greater point about all of that is Christians would hope that we would never get to that point. Churches should be strong where we can work things out between one another and that sort of thing. Not with gossip and that sort of thing, but with love. There should be self-reflection before bringing accusations. Honesty in our own motives, etc., should be at the forefront of our relationships. And one of the things that was brought up about why having these judges was a good thing is because you're taking it before somebody who isn't dealing with the emotion of the matter. They're dealing with the plain facts and what are the laws concerning those facts and that sort of thing. They would not necessarily have a stake in the outcome of the judgment. So when it comes to these kings, it was okay. Apparently, it was God understanding that this was going to be an eventual event. God describes what the king should be, but when kings come along, they tended to deviate from what they should have been, and that's the truth of the matter. All you have to do is read the Kings, and you'll see all the controversy and the intrigue and murder and just crazy things going on. People get power, and things happen. It's a good study on human on the human condition to see what happens, because given the power, people a lot of times can just go off kilter. In Samuel, asking for a king wasn't the sin. It was so they could be like the other nations. Their attitude was God's way doesn't work. The king's purpose was to bring the people closer to God. And so we see by the time in Samuel when they're asking for the king, it just isn't for the right reason. They stopped relying on God. There's no reason why they couldn't have asked for a king while still relying on God, especially if the king was practicing what God instituted. The king paradigm was a foreshadow of the Christ. God did not want them to depend on the king or a military, and that was kind of one of the final statements. God didn't want them getting this massive army of horses and that sort of thing. because he wanted them to rely on him. And so that was it. And as usual, that's usually where the topic goes, is having faith in God and not having faith in ourselves or in mankind, any man. Whether, in today's age, a president, really? We depend on the Congress? Come on. So that was the lesson. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, we're going to get into chapter 18. And God is going to continue dispensing his laws on their everyday life and on some of the other things that they need to think about. Thank you very much. If you have any questions about the Bible, about what God expects from his people, and you want to ask any of us, you can contact us through any one of our sites, either our main website, our YouTube, or our Facebook page. And we'd love to study with you. If you'd like to get involved with the online studies, just drop us a note. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and may God always continue to bless us. Thanks.